Hello everyone, this is Here's Trivia, and today we're continuing the 5 Elites of Wei Let's Talk Lore series with episode 2 of Yu Jin's arc, titled The Rise to Generalship. Now, we ended the last episode in January of the year 200, on the eve of the Guandu campaign. At the time, Yuan Shao's forces boasted superior numbers, but despite this, Yu Jin volunteered to spearhead the defenses at the key Yellow River ferry crossing at Yanjing. Inspired by Yu Jin's grit, Cao Cao left Yu Jin with just 2,000 infantry to defend Yanjing, as Cao Cao had to first deal with Liu Bei's rebellion back in the Xu province. Fortunately for both Cao Cao and Yu Jin, Yuan Shao wasted this valuable opportunity to strike first, as he was unable to muster his army in time. And when Liu Bei's rebellion was put down, Cao Cao even had the time to send 5,000 cavalry under the shared commands of Yu Jin and Yue Jin to cross north of the Yellow River and raid Yuan Shao's grain storage sites, as more than 30 would be burned down with thousands of troops killed and thousands more captured, including over 20 officers that would eventually surrender to serve Cao Cao. After this wildly successful raid, Yu Jin was reassigned to Yuanwu, a county just southwest of Yanjing, where Yu Jin would conduct a second northern raid that ended up destroying one of Yuan Shao's forward camps at Dushijin. And once the fighting shifted to Guandu, Yu Jin was promoted to the position of Pi Jiangjun, or Lieutenant General, as he would be recalled back to help defend the fortifications alongside Cao Cao's main army. In the early stages of the siege, Yuan Shao constructed many arrow towers that were even taller than the earthen wall that were constructed to protect Guandu. And as the volleys rained down on Cao Cao's army, there were many casualties and morale wavered, but thankfully, Yu Jin was able to keep his troops in place as they defended the wall under heavy fire until Cao Cao's engineers were able to counter the arrow towers with catapults that promptly destroyed them. After their eventual victory at Guandu, Yu Jin's heroics would be well rewarded with another promotion to Pianjiangjun, or General of the Lateral. Now, the victory at Guandu did not win Cao Cao the north, as Yuan Shao did manage to escape. But 2 years later, with Yuan Shao's death in 202, Cao Cao finally saw his opportunity to strike. However, at this time, Yu Jin was not included in the army prepared for the attack in the north, as instead he was tasked with defending the imperial capital at Xuchang alongside other notable generals such as Xiahou Dun and Li Dian. And their presence would be needed in 202, as Liu Bei, who had just taken refuge under the protection of Liu Biao in the Jin province, managed to persuade Liu Biao into allowing him to launch a northern strike at Xuchang, while Cao Cao's main army were busy fighting Yuan Shao's sons north of the Yellow River. Liu Bei's timing would be impeccable, as they easily pushed their relatively small force deep into Cao Cao's territory, all the way to Ye County on the outskirts of Xuchang, before the garrisons of Xiahou Dun, Yu Jin, and Li Dian arrived to hold them off. After a brief standoff that lasted a few days, Liu Bei suddenly burned down his own encampment in the middle of the night before retreating under the cover of darkness. By the next morning, when Xiahou Dun's patrols reported back the site of Liu Bei's now destroyed and empty encampment, Xiahou Dun ordered the army to pursue, as he was convinced that Liu Bei's smaller army probably retreated because they knew they couldn't win in a straight-up fight. Yet Li Dian disagreed with this assessment, as he believed that people never do things without a reason, and if the enemy suddenly retreats out of the blue, then the only logical explanation is that it is a trap. Li Dian goes on to explain the terrain ahead, as the road south is rather narrow, with an overgrowth of vegetations on both sides of the road that could easily conceal ambushing troops, and is particularly prone to fire. But with Xiahou Dun outranking Li Dian by a mile, Li Dian's wise words fell on deaf ears, as Xiahou Dun and Yu Jin organized their forces to chase while Li Dian was ordered to stand down and defend the encampment. Yet Li Dian was 100% correct, as what followed would be the famed ambush at Bowang Po, where Liu Bei unleashed a fire ambush on Xiahou Dun and Yu Jin's forces. And if it wasn't for Li Dian, who would end up disobeying orders and rushing to the site of the ambush in time to scare Liu Bei's army into retreating, Xiahou Dun and Yu Jin's forces would have certainly been annihilated. Now, one thing to note about this particular engagement is that in the novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, this battle is moved back 5 years into the future, where it will be split into two separate ambushes, where the burning of the encampment became inspiration for the burning of Xinye, followed up by the ambush at Bowang Po. The rationale behind this change was to give these victories over to Zhuge Liang, as they would become his first battles after joining Liu Bei's side. Historically speaking, these battles happened pretty much right after Liu Bei joined Liu Biao, with Liu Bei himself being the one who came up with these winning tactics. Now, going back to Yu Jin's story, the next time he would appear in historical records would be the 206 campaign against the rebellion of the Taishan bandit Changxi. For those of you who might remember from Zhang Liao's arc of our series, Changxi was a bandit that had flip-flopped sides multiple times ever since Cao Cao took control of the Xu province after Lu Bu's death. If we just review his multiple rebellions, then we can see that he first surrendered to Cao Cao in 198 after Lu Bu's defeat at Xiapi. Then just a year later, he rebelled as soon as Liu Bei retook the Xu province, only to be crushed by Cao Cao's forces again after Liu Bei was chased out of the Xu province in the year 200. So once again, Changxi surrenders to Cao Cao, but as soon as the Battle of Guandu broke out in the same year, Changxi would rebel again. This time, it would take the combined effort of Zhang Liao and Xiahou Yuan to once again subdue him for yet another surrender back to Cao Cao's side. And this would lead us to 206, as Changxi, for a third time, decided to rebel against Cao Cao. This time, Yu Jin was sent to crush the rebellion. Now, if you remember from our first episode, Yu Jin is also from the Taishan commandery and is actually an old acquaintance of Changxi. Yet despite their friendship, the fighting between the two were fierce, as neither could gain the upper hand. Noting that Yu Jin was unable to make progress against Changxi, Cao Cao ended up sending Xiahou Yuan to reinforce Yu Jin, as their combined forces would finally start to break through Changxi's defenses as dozens of bandit encampments would be taken down. Seeing that he could not hold out much longer, Changxi once again resorted to his old tactic of surrendering. However, this time, Changxi did not get the same treatment. At a meeting of the top officers within Yu Jin and Xiahou Yuan's army groups, most argue that only their lord, Cao Cao, could decide the fate of any surrendering general. But Yu Jin, who I will remind you again is an old friend of Changxi, ended up speaking out against this, as he instead argued that according to Cao Cao's past orders, if the enemy surrenders before the fighting, then he can be spared. But if he only surrenders after he's surrounded, then his crimes could not be forgiven. Therefore, even though Changxi is an old friend of mine, according to the letter of the law, he should be executed for his rebellion. And with no one able to persuade the strict disciplinarian Yu Jin from changing his mind, Yu Jin ended up going to Changxi to say their final goodbyes before personally executing Changxi, all while crying out of sadness for his friend. When Cao Cao later heard about Yu Jin's decision and Changxi's fate, Cao Cao lamented that it is only destiny for Changxi to end up surrendering to the one person in Yu Jin who would be so merciless in following his every order. But at the same time, Cao Cao's trust in Yu Jin only grew, as soon after the rebellion, Cao Cao reported Yu Jin's achievements to the emperor and had Yu Jin promoted to Hu Wei Jiangjun, or the general of the Tiger's Might. From this position, Yu Jin would earn his command of one of the newly created Jin province divisions in 208 just before the Battle of Chibi. However, there are no records of his participation in the Battle of Chibi itself, as he was most likely stationed in parts of the northern Jin province. And perhaps because Yu Jin's unit didn't suffer many casualties during the Battle of Chibi, that he would end up becoming one of the units sent to attack the Huainan bandits in Meicheng and Chenlan at Mount Tianzhu in 209. Now, the details of this campaign were already shared during Zhang Liao's arc for this series, as Zhang Liao did most of the heavy lifting in this campaign. Sadly for Yu Jin, his only role in this campaign would be getting tricked by Mei Cheng's false surrender, and because of this blemish, Yu Jin did not end up with any major promotions after this campaign was won off of the back of Zhang Liao's brave charge up Mount Tianzhu. Instead, Yu Jin got a minor symbolic increase in his title land's tax stipend, as it went from 1,000 households to 1,200 households. And this, unfortunately, would not be Yu Jin's only military blemish, as we'll end our episode here. Next time when we return, we will cover Yu Jin's career-defining mistake during the Siege of Fan Castle and its impact on his legacy. Now, hopefully you all have enjoyed this episode enough to consider subscribing to the channel for more content on Three Kingdoms history, or simply support the channel by leaving a comment below, or just by hitting the like button. And as always, I'll see you all next time. Bye!